Section 63 of Reviews by Oscar Wilde. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lizzie Driver. Reviews by Oscar Wilde. Edited by Robert Ross. Section 63. Literary and Other Notes. 4. Woman's World, February 1888. Canute the Great by Michael Field is in many respects a really remarkable work of art. Its tragic element is to be found in life, not in death; in the hero's psychological development, not in his moral declension, or in any other physical calamity. And the author has borrowed from modern science the idea that in the evolutionary struggle for existence, the true tragedy may be that of the survivor. Canute, the rough, generous Viking, finds himself alienated from his gods, his forefathers, his very dreams. With centuries of pagan blood in his veins, he sets himself to the task of becoming a great Christian governor and lawgiver to men. And yet he is fully conscious that, while he has abandoned the noble impulses of his race, he still retains that which in his nature is most fierce or fearful. It is not by faith that he reaches the new creed, nor through gentleness that he seeks after the new culture. The beautiful Christian woman whom he has made queen of his life and lands teaches him no mercy, and knows nothing of forgiveness. It is sin and not suffering that purifies him, mere sin itself. Be not afraid, I have learnt this: sin is a mighty bond twixt God and man. Love that has ne'er forgiven is virgin and untender. Spousal passion becomes acquainted with life's vilest things, transmutes them and exalts. O wonderful this touch of pardon, all the shame cast out, the heart a-rippling with gaiety, the leaping consciousness that heaven knows all, and yet esteems us royal. Think of it, the joy, the hope! This strange and powerful conception is worked out in a manner as strong as it is subtle, and indeed almost every character in the play seems to suggest some new psychological problem. The mere handling of the verse is essentially characteristic of our modern introspective method, and it presents to us, not thought in its perfected form, but the involutions of thought seeking for expression. We seem to witness the very workings of the mind, and to watch the passion struggling for utterance. In plays of this kind, plays that are meant to be read, not to be acted, it must be admitted that we often miss that narrative and descriptive element which in the epic is so great a charm, and indeed may be said to be almost essential to the perfect literary presentation of any story. This element the Greek managed to retain by the introduction of chorus and messenger, but we seem to have been unable to invent any substitute for it. That there is here a distinct loss cannot, I think, be denied. There is something harsh, abrupt, and inartistic in such a stage direction as Canute strangles Edric, flings his body into the stream, and gazes out. It strikes no dramatic note. It conveys no picture. It is meagre and inadequate. If acted it might be fine, but as read it is unimpressive. However, there is no form of art that has not got its limitations, and though it is sad to see the action of a play relegated to a formal footnote, still there is undoubtedly a certain gain in psychological analysis and psychological concentration. It is a far cry from the Nutlinger Saga to Rossetti's Notebook, but Michael Field passes from one to the other without any loss of power. Indeed, most readers will probably prefer The Cup of Water, which is the second play in the volume, to the earlier historical drama. It is more purely poetical, and if it has less power, it has certainly more beauty. Rossetti conceived the idea of a story in which a young king falls passionately in love with a little peasant girl who gives him a cup of water, and is by her beloved in turn. But being betrothed to a noble lady, he yields her in marriage to his friend, on condition that once a year, on the anniversary of their meeting, she brings him a cup of water. The girl dies in childbirth, leaving a daughter who grows into her mother's perfect likeness, and comes to meet the king when he is a-hunting. Just, however, as he is about to take the cup from her hand, a second figure, in her exact likeness, but dressed in peasant's clothes, steps to his side, looks in the king's face, and kisses him on the mouth. He falls forward on his horse's neck, and is lifted up dead. Michael Field has struck out the supernatural element so characteristic of Rossetti's genius, and in some other respects modified for dramatic purposes, material Rossetti left unused. The result is a poem of exquisite and pathetic grace. Cara, the peasant girl, is a creation as delicate as it is delightful, and it deserves to rank beside the faun of Kalarahoy. As for the young king who loses all the happiness of his life through one noble moment of unselfishness, and who recognized as he stands over Cara's dead body that women are not chattel, to deal with as one's generosity may prompt or straiten, and that we must learn to drink's life pleasures if we would be pure, he is one of the most romantic figures in all modern dramatic work. Looked at from a purely technical point of view, Michael Field's verse is sometimes lacking in music, and has no sustained grandeur of movement. But it is extremely dramatic, and its method is admirably suited to express those swift touches of nature and sudden flashes of thought which are Michael Field's distinguishing qualities. As for the moral contained in these plays, work that has the rich variety of life has always something of life's mystery also. It cannot be narrowed down to a formal creed, nor summed up in a platitude. It has many answers, and more than one secret. Miss Frances Martin's Life of Elizabeth Gilbert is an extremely interesting book. Elizabeth Gilbert was born at a time, as her biographer reminds us, kindly and intelligent men and women could gravely implore the Almighty to take away a child merely because it was blind, when they could argue that to teach the blind to read, or attempt to teach them to work, was to fly in the face of Providence. And her whole life was given to the endeavour to overcome this prejudice and superstition, to show that blindness, through a great privation, is not necessarily a disqualification, and that blind men and women can learn, labour, and fulfil all the duties of life. Before her day, all that the blind were taught was to commit texts from the Bible to memory. She saw that they could learn handicrafts, and be made industrious and self-supporting. She began with a small cellar in Holborn, at the rent of 18 pence a week, but before her death she could point to large and well-appointed workshops in almost every city of England, where blind men and women are employed, where tools have been invented by or modified for them, and where agencies have been established for the sale of their work. The whole story of her life is full of pathos and of beauty. She was not born blind, but lost her sight through an attack of scarlet fever when she was 3 years old. For a long time she could not realize her position, and we hear of the little child making earnest appeals to be taken out of the dark room, or to have a candle lighted, and once she whispered to her father, "If I am a very good little girl, may I see my doll to-morrow?" However, all memory of vision seems to have faded from her before she left the sick-room, though, taught by those around her, she soon began to take an imaginary interest in colour, and a very real one in form and texture. An old nurse is still alive, who remembers making a pink frock for her when she was a child. Her delight at its being pink, and her pleasure in stroking down the folds. and when, in 1835, the young Princess Victoria visited Oxford with her mother, Bessie, as she was always called, came running home exclaiming, "Oh, mamma, I have seen the Duchess of Kent, and she had on a brown silk dress." Her youthful admiration of Wordsworth was based chiefly upon his love of flowers, but also on personal knowledge. When she was about 10 years old, Wordsworth went to Oxford to receive the honorary degree of D.C.L. from the University. He stayed with Dr. Gilbert, the principal at Brasenose, and won Bessie's heart the first day by telling at the dinner-table how he had almost leapt off the coach in Bagley Wood to gather the blue veronica. But she had a better reason for remembering that visit. One day she was in the drawing-room alone, and Wordsworth entered. For a moment he stood silent before the blind child. The little sensitive face, with all its wondering, inquiring look, turned towards him. Then he gravely said, "Madam, I hope I do not disturb you." She never forgot that "madam," grave, solemn, and almost reverential. As for the great practical work of her life, the amelioration of the condition of the blind, Miss Martin gives a wonderful account of her noble efforts and her noble success, and the volume contains a great many interesting letters from eminent people, of which the following characteristic note from Mr. Ruskin is not the least interesting. Denmark Hill, 2nd September, 1871. Madam, I am obliged by your letter, and I deeply sympathize with the objects of the institution over which you preside. But one of my main principles of work is that everyone must do their best, and spend their all in their own work. And mine is with a much lower race of sufferers than you plead for, with those who have eyes and see not. I am, madam, your faithful servant, J. Ruskin. Miss Martin is a most sympathetic biographer, and her book should be read by all who care to know the history of one of the remarkable women of our century. Ourselves and Our Neighbours is a pleasant volume of social essays from the pen of one of the most graceful and attractive of all American poetesses, Mrs. Louise Chandler Moulton. Mrs. Moulton, who has a very light literary touch, discusses every important modern problem, from society rosebuds and old bachelors, down to the latest fashions in bonnets and in sonnets. The best chapter in the book is that entitled "The Gospel of Good Gowns," which contains some very excellent remarks on the ethics of dress. Mrs. Moulton sums up her position in the following passage: "The desire to please is a natural characteristic of unspoiled womanhood. If I lived in the woods, I should dress for the trees," said a woman widely known for taste and for culture. Every woman's dress should be, and if she has any ideality will be, an expression of herself. The true gospel of dress is that of fitness and taste. Pictures are painted, and music is written, and flowers are fostered, that life may be made beautiful. Let women delight our eyes like pictures, be harmonious as music, and fragrant as flowers, that they also may fulfil their mission of grace and of beauty. By companionship with beautiful thoughts shall their taste be so formed that their toilets will never be out of harmony with their means or their position. They will be clothed almost as unconsciously as the lilies of the field, but each one will be herself, and there will be no more uniformity in their attire than in their faces. The modern dryad who is ready to "dress for the trees" seems to me a charming type, but I hardly think that Mrs. Moulton is right when she says that the woman of the future will be clothed almost as unconsciously as the lilies of the field. Possibly, however, she means merely to emphasize the distinction between dressing and dressing up, a distinction which is often forgotten. Warring Angels is a very sad and suggestive story. It contains no impossible heroine and no improbable hero. but is simply a faithful transcript from life, a truthful picture of men and women as they are. Darwin could not have enjoyed it, as it does not end happily. There is at least no distribution of cakes and ale in the last chapter. But then, scientific people are not always the best judge of literature. They seem to think that the sole aim of art should be to amuse, and had they been consulted on the subject, would have banished Melpomene from Parnassus. It may be admitted, however, that not a little of our modern art is somewhat harsh and painful. Our Castalet is very salt with tears, and we have bound the brows of the Muses with cypress and with yew. We are often told that we are a shallow age, yet we are certainly the saddest literature for all the ages, for we have made truth and not beauty the aim of art, and seem to value imitation more than imagination. This tendency is, of course, more marked in fiction than it is in poetry. Beauty of form is always in itself a source of joy. The mere technique of verse has an imaginative and spiritual element, and life must to a certain degree be transfigured before it can find its expression in music. But ordinary fiction, rejecting the beauty of form in order to realize the facts of life, seems often to lack the vital element of delight, to miss that pleasure-giving power in virtue of which the arts exist. It would not, however, be fair to regard Warring Angels simply as a specimen of literary photography. It is a marked distinction of style, a definite grace and simplicity of manner. There is nothing crude in it, though it is to a certain degree inexperienced, nothing violent, though it is often strong. The story it has to tell has frequently been told before, but the treatment makes it new. And Lady Flower, for whose white soul the angels of good and evil are at war, is admirably conceived and admirably drawn. A Song of Jubilee and other poems contains some pretty picturesque verses. Its author is Mrs. De Courcy Laffan, who, under the name of Mrs. Leith Adams, is well known as a novelist and story writer. The Jubilee Ode is quite as good as most of the Jubilee Odes have been, and some of the short poems are graceful. This, from the first butterfly, is pretty. O little bird without a song, I love thy silent presence, floating in the light, a living, perfect thing, when scarcely yet the snow-white blossom crawls along the wall, and not a daisy shows its star-like head amid the grass. Miss Bella Duffy's Life of Madame de Stael forms part of that admirable Eminent Women series, which is so well edited by Mr. John H. Ingram. There is nothing absolutely new in Miss Duffy's book, but this was not to be expected. Unpublished correspondence, that delight of the eager biographer, is not to be had in the case of Madame de Stael. The de Broglie family having either destroyed or successfully concealed all the papers which might have revealed any facts not already in the possession of the world. Upon the other hand, the book has the excellent quality of condensation, and gives us in less than 200 pages a very good picture of Madame de Stael and her day. Miss Duffy's criticism of Corinne is worth quoting. Corinne is a classic which everybody is bound to speak with respect. The enormous admiration which it exacted at the time of its appearance may seem somewhat strange in this year of grace, but then it must be remembered that Italy was not the overwritten country it has since become. Besides this, Madame de Stael was the most conspicuous personage of her day. Except Chateaubriand, she had nobody to dispute with her the palm of literary glory in France. Her exile, her literary circle, her courageous opinions, had kept the eyes of Europe fixed on her for years, so that any work from her pen was sure to excite the liveliest curiosity. Corinne is a kind of glorified guide-book, with some of the qualities of a good novel. It is very long-winded, but the appetite of the age was robust in that respect, and the highly strung emotions of the hero and heroine could not shock a taste which had been formed by the sorrows of Werther. It is extremely moral, deeply sentimental, and of deadly earnestness. Three characteristics which could not fail to recommend it to a dreary and ponderous generation, the most deficient in taste that ever trod the earth. But it is artistic, in the sense that the interest is concentrated from first to last on the central figure, and the drama, such as it is, unfolds itself naturally from its starting point, which is the contrast between the characters of Oswald and Corinne. The dreary and ponderous generation, the most deficient in taste that ever trod the earth, seems to me a somewhat exaggerated mode of expression, but glorified guide-book is a not unfallacious description of a novel that once thrilled Europe. Miss Duffy sums up her opinion of Madame de Stael as a writer in the following passage: "Her mind was strong of grasp and wide in range, but continuous effort fatigued it. She could strike out isolated sentences alternately brilliant, exhaustive, and profound, but she could not link them to other sentences so as to form an organic whole. Her thought was definite singly, but vague as a whole. She always saw things separately, and tried to combine them arbitrarily, and it is generally difficult to follow out any idea of hers from its origin to its end. Her thoughts are like pearls of peace profusely scattered, or carelessly strung together, but not set in any design. On closing one of her books, the reader is left with no continuous impression. He has been dazzled and delighted, enlightened also by flashes, but the horizons disclosed have vanished again, and the outlook is enriched by no new vistas. Then she was deficient in the higher qualities of the imagination. She could analyze, but not characterize, construct, but not create. She could take one defect like selfishness, or one passion like love, and display its workings, or she could describe a whole character, like Napoleon's, with marvellous penetration. But she could not make her personages talk or act like human beings. She lacked pathos, and had no sense of humour. In short, hers was a mind endowed with enormous powers of comprehension, and an amazing richness of ideas, but deficient in perception of beauty, in poetry, and in true originality. She was a great social personage, but her influence on literature was not destined to be lasting, because, in spite of foreseeing too much, she had not the true prophetic sense of proportion, and confused the things of the present with those of the future, the accidental with the enduring. I cannot but think that in this passage Miss Duffy rather underrates Madame de Stael's influence on the literature of the 19th century. It is true that she gave our literature no new form, but one of those who gave it new spirit, and the romantic movement owes her no small debt. However, a biography should be read for its pictures more than for its criticisms, and Miss Duffy shows a remarkable narrative power, and tells with a good deal of spirit the wonderful adventures of the brilliant woman whom Hame termed a whirlwind in petticoats. Mr. Harcourt's reprint of John Evelyn's Life of Mrs. Godolphin is a welcome addition to the list of charming library books. Mr. Harcourt's grandfather, the Archbishop of York, himself John Evelyn's great-great-grandson, inherited the manuscript from his distinguished ancestor, and in 1847 entrusted it for publication to Samuel Wilberforce, then Bishop of Oxford. As the book has been for a long time out of print, this new edition is sure to awake fresh interest in the life of the noble and virtuous lady whom John Evelyn so much admired. Margaret Godolphin was one of the Queen's maids of honour at the court of Charles II, and was distinguished for the delicate purity of her nature, as well as for her high intellectual attainments. Some of the extracts Evelyn gives from her diary seems to show an austere, formal, almost ascetic spirit. But it was inevitable that a nature so refined as hers should have turned in horror from such ideals of life as were presented by men like Buckingham and Rochester, like Etheridge, Killigrew, and Sedley, like the king himself, to whom she could scarcely bring herself to speak. After her marriage she seems to have become happier and brighter, and her early death makes her a pathetic and interesting figure in the history of the time. Evelyn can see no fault in her, and his life of her is the most wonderful of all panegyrics. Amongst the maids of honour mentioned by John Evelyn is Frances Jennings, the elder sister of the great Duchess of Marlborough. Miss Jennings, who was one of the most beautiful women of her day, married first Sir George Hamilton, brother of the author of the Memoirs de Grammont, and afterwards Richard Talbot, who was made Duke of Tyrconnel by James II. William's successful occupation of Ireland, where her husband was Lord Deputy, reduced her to poverty and obscurity, and she was probably the first peeress who ever took to millinery as a livelihood. She had a dressmaker's shop in the Strand, and, not wishing to be detected, sat in a white mask and a white dress, and was known by the name of the White Widow. I was reminded of the Duchess when I read Miss Emily Faithfull's admirable article in Gralingany on "Ladies as Shopkeepers." "The most daring innovation in England at this moment," says Miss Faithfull, "is the lady shopkeeper. At present but few people have had the courage to brave the current social prejudice. We draw such fine distinctions between the wholesale and retail traders, that our cotton spinners, calico makers, and general merchants seem to think that they belong to a totally different sphere, from which they look down on the lady who has had sufficient brains, capital, and courage to open a shop. But the old world moves faster than it did in former days, and before the end of the 19th century it is probable that a gentlewoman will be recognized in spite of her having entered on commercial pursuits, especially as we are growing accustomed to see scions of our noblest families on our stock exchange and in tea merchants' houses. One peer of the realm is now doing an extensive business in coals, and another is a cab proprietor." Miss Faithfull then proceeds to give a most interesting account of the London dairy, opened by the Honourable Mrs. Maberley, of Madame Isabel's millinery establishment, and of the wonderful work done by Miss Charlotte Robinson, who has recently been appointed decorator to the Queen. About 3 years ago, Miss Faithfull tells us, Miss Robinson came to Manchester and opened a shop in King Street, and, regardless of that bugbear which terrifies most women, the loss of social status, she put up her own name over the door, and without the least self-assertion, quietly entered into competition with the sterner sex. The result has been eminently satisfactory. This year Miss Robinson has exhibited at Saltaire and at Manchester, and next year she proposes to exhibit at Glasgow and possibly at Brussels. At first she had some difficulty in making people understand that her work is really commercial, not charitable. She feels that, until a healthy public opinion is created, women will pose as destitute ladies, and never take a dignified position in any calling they adopt. Gentlemen, who earn their own living, are not spoken of as destitute, and we must banish this idea in connection with ladies who are engaged in an equally honourable manner. Miss Faithfull concludes her most valuable article as follows: "The more highly educated our women of business are, the better for themselves, their work, and the whole community. Many of the professions to which ladies have hitherto turned are overcrowded, and when once the fear of losing social position is boldly disregarded, it will be found that commercial life offers a variety of more or less lucrative employments to ladies of birth and capital, who find it more congenial to their tastes and requirements to invest their money and spend their energies in a business which yields a fair return, rather than sit at home content with a scanty pittance." I myself entirely agree with Miss Faithfull, though I feel that there is something to be said in favour of the view put forward by Lady Shrewsbury in the Woman's World, and a great deal to be said in favour of Mrs. Joyce's scheme for emigration. Mr. Walter Besant, if we are to judge from his last novel, is of Lady Shrewsbury's way of thinking. I hope that some of my readers will be interested in Miss Beatrice Crane's little poem, Blush Roses, for which her father, Mr. Walter Crane, has done so lovely and graceful a design. Mrs. Simon, of Birkdale Park, Southport, tells me that she offered a prize last term at her school for the best sonnet on any work of art. The poems were sent to Professor Dowden, who awarded the prize to the youthful authoress of the following sonnet on Mr. Watts's picture of Hope. She sits with drooping form and fair bent head, low bent to hear the faintly sounding strain that thrills her with the sweet uncertain pain of timid trust and restful tears unshed. Around she feels vast spaces, awe and dread, encompass her, and the dark doubt she fain would banish sees the shuddering fear remain, and ever presses near with stealthy tread. But not for ever will the misty space close down upon her meekly patient eyes. The steady light within them soon will open their heavy lids, and then the sweet fair face, uplifted in a sudden glad surprise, will find the bright reward which comes to hope. I myself am rather inclined to prefer this sonnet on Mr. Watts's Psyche. The 6th line is deficient, but in spite of the faulty technique, there is a great deal that is suggestive in it. Unfathomable, boundless mystery, last work of the Creator, deathless, vast. Soul, essence moulded of a changeful past. Thou art the offspring of eternity, breath of his breath, by his vitality, engendered, in his image cast, part of the nature song, whereof the last chord soundeth never in the harmony. Psyche, thy form is shadowed o'er with pain, born of intensest longing, and the rain of a world's weeping lieth like a sea of silent soundless sorrow in thine eyes. Yet grief is not eternal, for clouds rise from out the ocean everlasting. I have to thank Mr. William Rossetti for kindly allowing me to reproduce Dante Gabriel Rossetti's drawing of the authoress of Goblin Market, and thanks are also due to Mr. Lafayette of Dublin for the use of his photograph of Her Royal Highness the Princess of Wales in her academic robes as Doctor of Music, which served as our frontispiece last month, and to Messrs. Hills and Saunders of Oxford, and Mr. Lord and Mr. Blanchard of Cambridge, for a similar courtesy in the case of the article on Greek plays at the universities. 1. Canute the Great, by Michael Field, Bell and Sons. 2. Life of Elizabeth Gilbert, by Francis Martin, Macmillan and Company. 3. Ourselves and Our Neighbours, by Louise Chandler Moulton, Ward and Downey. 4. Warring Angels, Fisher Unwin. 5. A Song of Jubilee and Other Poems, by Mrs. de Courcy Laffan, Kegan Paul. 6. Life of Madame de Stael, by Bella Duffy, Eminent Women Series. 7. Life of Mrs. Godolphin, by John Evelyn Esquire of Wooton, edited by William Harcourt of Nunham, Sampson Low, Marston and Company. End of section 63.